I'd like to tell you the story of a silly little hole in the ground filled with silly little lizards. But to tell you the story of the kobold fortress of Leopardbends, I must first tell you the story of its first unlikely hero. This is Sue. She is also a kobold, but she lives in a small hillocks called Twinklebuttons in this kind of middle south area of the Blunt Hills region. This hillocks is on the frontier, in the borderlands between their larger kobold kingdom to the west and that of a dwarven nation to the east. There's also other dwarves and other kobolds and elves and humans and goblins, but they aren't important yet. What is important is that Sue knew that there was a larger world to be seen and discovered. She was driven by a hunger for new knowledge, but she knew she wasn't going to find it surrounded by farmers and drunkards. So Sue made up her mind. She would set out on adventure. She would travel to strange lands and make great discoveries. She gathered up all the shinies she could muster and traded them for the fanciest of fancies she could afford. A steel mail shirt. With what she had left over, she got a crossbow, a ton of iron bolts, extra backpacks, extra food, and extra water. There was no way she was going to starve to death in the wilderness like a chump. But it is famously dangerous to go alone, so Sue asked her best friend in the whole wide world if she would join her on this endeavor. Her name was Srow, and when Sue asked Srow to accompany her, it was totally because they were absolute rock-solid besties and not at all because Srow had a pet giant cave spider. Hey, Srow, you want to do a thing? Yeah, sure. You want to bring your spider? Yeah, sure. And so Sue, Srow, and the spider set out on their sojourn in search of something. But Sue wasn't going to just lug around all that excess gear on her own 2 feet like a chump. Hey, whoa, what are you doing? I'm going to ride your spider. No, you're not. I'm not? No. And his name is Roar. Oh. Can I put these saddlebags on him? No. And so Sue lugged around all that excess gear on her own 2 feet. Like a chump. They headed towards the kobold fortress of Merchant Waned, in search of useful information or someone who could give them a worthwhile quest. But before they got too far, they happened upon a massive stampede of stray livestock, which sounds much more terrifying than it actually was. Sue grabbed a pair of stray horses and claimed them for herself, quickly loading them up with all her excess supplies and hopping on. Haha, I am so smart! Sue made it about half a day of traveling before losing the horses entirely, along with all the extra ammo and rations they carried. But soon they arrived at Merchant Waned and made their way to the surface tavern to speak with the locals. The locals were not so helpful. Can anyone here give me a real quest or something? This sucks, let's go. They started climbing down the long ramp into the fortress proper, and the first thing they saw was a statue depicting Utost Copper Kobold, the dwarven goddess of mountains. Before the statue was a display case with a single 4-sided die. Sue rolled the die. It says, 1 week bad luck. This place is whack. Perhaps they needed to look beyond the lands of their kobold kin. There were some dwarven hillocks further to the north, and by all accounts they were friendly enough. Maybe they could set Sue on the trail of something significant. They made it to Cobalt Rough without any incidents except for that time Roar had just devoured an entire owl. But they entered the civic mound and found the chubby mayor. Hello, chubby mayor. My name is Tilliri. Is there anything exciting going on around here? There's an army marching on our homelands in the east. And so they headed west, this time to another kobold hillocks called Bewitched Phrased. Sue found the local drinking mound, expecting to find nothing but a bunch of drunks, but was pleasantly surprised to see a monk. Also a lot of drunks, but one of them was a monk. Sue chatted with the monk and learned of a missing treasure that was last seen in the kobold fortress of Playpaints, off in the mountains to the west. As good a quest as any, Sue supposed. However, upon leaving the hillocks, our adventurers were immediately ambushed by a bunch of kobolds, and also a single unarmed dwarf for some reason. Though it's not exactly clear why they were attacking. In fact, all of these attackers belonged to the same kobold civilization as Sue and Srow. Just kobold things, I suppose. Sue drew her crossbow. All right, let's do this! Srow was already running off in the other direction, assuming a submissive posture. Roar, however, was going for it. Sue fired a bolt at the unarmed dwarf just as Roar lunged. Spider fangs sank deep into dwarf flesh, but then 3 kobolds jumped on Roar and started slashing. The dwarf and the spider were both dead before Sue had a chance to load a second bolt into her crossbow. Hey, can we talk about this? The kobolds did not want to talk about this. I yield! But they just pounced. In the end, there isn't a whole lot you can do about a silver mace to the head. Well, you could probably wear a helmet, but we all live and learn. Except for Sue. Sue is dead. And so is Roar. Srow, on the other hand, did what any reasonable kobold would do and ran away as fast as she possibly could. She ran, she dodged, she ran some more. It turns out she can actually go pretty fast when she's not keeping pace behind someone carrying half their own body weight in iron bolts. Who knew? Srow kept running until she came to an abandoned monastery. It was at this point Srow started to wonder why she ever came along on this journey in the first place. She never wanted to make some big discovery. All she ever wanted was to raise a family. And now her best friend was dead, and she was all alone in the wilderness. She made camp just outside the monastery, but was awoken in the night by a pack of wild dingoes. She made a half effort at running away, but they were much too fast. They caught up and surrounded her, taking turns lunging and biting. Srow really never wanted any of this. She wanted to be somewhere safe, where she didn't have to worry about being eaten or stabbed by every living creature that laid eyes on her. But instead, she was in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night, dodging dingoes. Quite proficiently, I must add. Is this really how it ends for you, Srow? Eaten by a pack of dogs in the night? Like a chump? No, I didn't think so. Srow looked down at the carnage before her and grinned. She may not have been an especially violent kobold, but she did appreciate a good butt-kicking. She took the skulls of the dingoes as trophies and continued on, wandering north through another abandoned monastery. She didn't really know what she was looking for. Maybe she wasn't looking for anything. Maybe she was just letting herself follow the subtle guidance of fate. Whatever the case may be, Srow soon found herself at the entrance of the fledgling kobold fortress of Leopardbends. Carved into the steep mountainside of a single lonely volcano in the Blunt Hills, this was little more than a wiggly hole in the ground. But that's probably all a kobold ever expects from a home anyway. Maybe that was a benefit in Srow's mind. His fortress was barely a year old, and had maybe 24 residents. It was already hosting some random dwarves and elves in the tavern, but the vast majority were her kobold kin. She could stay in the fortress as long as she liked, even if she wasn't an official citizen. So Srow just hung out for a while, passing the days in the tavern or helping the residents with some of the more menial tasks. Meanwhile, the fortress slowly grew. They dug out an underground pasture for the sheep, they dug out some militia quarters, and then the miners married each other. You know, fortress things. Many faces came and went over the coming months. Srow hardly kept track. Poets, bards, mercenaries, they were all the same. Even Saxel, the dwarven monster hunter, didn't warrant much more than a passing glance, even if he did march around all day in steel armor, waiting for monsters to appear. Maybe it shouldn't have been surprising, then, that he got a little too bored or too drunk and started a round of fisticuffs with the closest lizard to hand. Poor Elk did not fare well. She immediately panicked, and struggled to land a blow in return. Not that naked kobold fist can do much against steel armor. Saxel beat Elk into unconsciousness and stood over her prone form. No one dared confront him. After a long moment, Elk stood up and lunged, terrified but ferocious, throwing everything she had at the dwarf. Saxel responded with his spear. Whether out of anger or hate or reflex, we will never know, but the result was immediate. Elk was cut down in an instant, and the tavern emptied out. Saxel turned and stabbed Teres as he ran through the door. Then he just started murdering puppies, in case it wasn't clear that he'd gone full bad guy. There was simply no stopping him. He killed the dogs. He killed the blobs. He chased a peacock down the hallway. The dwarf mercenary, Shorast, met him head-on in the tunnels. Easily the best-equipped individual in the fort aside from Saxel himself, Shorast put up a solid fight. He hit Saxel's armored legs and feet hard enough that Saxel could no longer walk, but in the end he would share the same fate as many of the little lizard people he gave his life protecting. He killed the sheep. He killed the snakes. He rampaged through the halls unchecked, too terrified to stop stabbing everything that moved. And where was Srow amidst all this chaos? Why, in the tavern, of course, listening to music while a pair of rhinoceroses ran down the corridor. But enough was finally enough. Srow found Shorast's gear and tossed it on, grabbing a copper axe and a bronze shield. When she finally caught up to Saxel, he was stumbling through the tunnels, mumbling, "I must take my leave, I must take my leave." He didn't attack Srow, but he also definitely wasn't leaving. Srow followed the dwarf until they reached the dormitory by the entrance. "Hey man, I think you should leave." "I must take my leave." "Yes, I agree. Get the heck out of here." "I must take." "Okay, buddy, how about you just hand over that spear?" "Over my dead body." "Fair enough. How about, we trade? I'll trade you that steel spear for this steel mail shirt." "That seems fair." Saxel put the steel mail shirt on over his other steel mail shirt. And it was now that Saxel was unarmed and extra armored, that Srow struck. She lunged with his spear, but he just blocked with his shield. Saxel struck back, swinging his shield wildly about, but Srow was able to dodge and parry everything the dwarf threw at her. Srow scored a hit on Saxel's left arm, breaking his bones through his gauntlet, but he just moved to hold his shield in his right hand. So she stabbed him in the right arm too, and he finally dropped the shield. But even still, the dwarf was well protected by those two mail shirts. Srow punched and stabbed and wrestled but couldn't land a finishing blow. She stabbed until he was rendered immobile and unconscious. Stabbed until she had broken every possible bone in his body, even though she never actually pierced his skin. In the end, she just stabbed the unconscious dwarf in the head so many times that it broke his neck. There. It was done. The fortress was quiet again. Perhaps too quiet now. There remained only 9 kobolds and 1 dwarf, including Srau, in a fortress filled with corpses, heading into winter. But you know what? That was fine with Srau. Well, not like fine, but, you know. This was at least a challenge worth facing head-on. At least for the time being, Srau would stay in Leopardbends and do her best to help her fellow survivors piece their lives back together. And in time, this place would recover. It will continue to grow. It will develop and flourish and thrive. There is so much potential to be had here. I hope you stick around for future installments as we recount this continued saga of Leopardbends. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this or want to see more of me, maybe click a button about it